My name's David Reedy. I'm currently General Secretary of the United Kingdom Literacy Association, and it's my absolute privilege to chair this extraordinarily distinguished panel. I'm just going to introduce them to you, and then say a few words about some UKLA research, and then pass that over to the panel to sort of talk about and to respond to, and ask them some hard questions in a moment. So we've got Michael, closest to me. The person you probably haven't been introduced to at any point during the course of the day is Lauren Child, a wonderful illustrator and author who's sitting next to Michael. So welcome, Lauren. It's lovely to see you. We've got Nikki at the end, and we've got Kim next to her, who you've met. Now, just to talk about UKLA for a second. UKLA's done quite a bit of research around reading for pleasure and classroom strategies. Some very straightforward strategies for developing engagement and pleasure in reading. There are only 5 basic ones, and they resonate very much, I think, with some of the things that Michael's been saying over the last few minutes. Number 1, reading aloud to children every day. Number 2, adults share, particularly teachers, sharing their reading lives with children. What is it that we read and what do we love to read? And telling children about that. And finding out what children are passionate about and what they choose to read, and when they choose to read. 3, organising time for reading independently and opportunities to choose what they read. So browsing, children having opportunities to browse, absolutely crucially important. 4th, teachers being knowledgeable about children's books and being able to recommend texts. And 5th and last, a vibrant reading environment, including class and school libraries.
I've never been in the classroom as a teacher, so please don't think that I'm in any way trying to tell you what to do. But we did do a survey of 8,000 young people's reading habits a while ago. And one of the things that became clear, and this is really at the turn of the millennium, so it's quite a while ago, and I think the situation has not got any better, and that is that children tend to be overscheduled. And I would say that one of the things children need in order to turn to books sometimes is just time and maybe a little bit of boredom. So when you said organize time for reading, I think that is something that we might have to think about doing. You know, a lot of families do believe that they tell a story every night. They do believe that they have at least preserved one little bit of time. But it's amazing how easily that gets eroded. You know, we have time for sports, we have time for music lessons, we have time for, television, we have time for lots of other things, and maybe we need to preserve a regular time for reading. And the other thing that we found is that it was very often the case that in houses where people assumed reading was taking place because parents had been to university, there were a lot of books bought, a lot of books on the shelves, a lot of books in the child's bedroom. Actually, often those parents were the busiest parents of all. And what did they think? It was happening by osmosis in a way that the children were somehow getting stories, but nobody had time to read them. And so there was a middle class, a kind of impoverishment in the story cycle that took a lot of people by surprise. So I think needing to be conscious about organizing that time. There was a wonderful book written a few years ago by the French writer and teacher Daniel Pennac called Reads Like a Novel. And he had a class full of older, reluctant readers. And what he did was read aloud to them. Because sometimes when you can't hear those words in your head, your teacher said to you, read, hear the words off the page. Some kids can't make that happen, initially at least. And to get them hooked and to get the sense of how language works and to get them internalizing it, reading aloud is the best thing. So your head teacher did exactly the right thing, didn't she? He was saying, we have to have reading aloud.
Was that the book in which he had these 10 rules of reading? I think it was, wasn't it?
Yes.
Which are, look him up, if you haven't found him already, Daniel Pennac. He's French, but he can't help it. And he's written I'm very pro-Europe, don't get me wrong. And he wrote these wonderful 10 rules, and they're so liberating. That's what's wonderful about it.
Yes, the rights of a reader.
The rights of a reader.
One of which, of course, is the right not to read.
The right not to
story.
read, yes.
And you can download a wonderful poster for your classroom, illustrated by Quentin Blake.
Yeah.
So do get one. They're wonderful.
Yeah.
Not to assume that reading aloud will always work. You have to read aloud well. And I have seen people absolutely massacre the Gruffalo. I've seen some student teachers who've turned children off reading by reading aloud. And I don't know whether Mike is still here, Mike Dodsworth, but we've had conversations in the past about, wouldn't it be wonderful? We shouldn't assume that everybody can naturally read aloud well. We've been fortunate because people have read to us, and we have what Michael talked about, the musicality of the language, and we know how it goes. Unfortunately, not all of our colleagues have that, and I think teacher training on reading aloud, which would involve those of us who love reading aloud, reading to them. That's the best possible lesson, but not to assume, but to support teachers in reading aloud well, I think is worth doing.
I did have parents who read aloud to me every night, and even when we were actually quite old, my father always used to, when we went on holiday, always used to park the car somewhere in the Dales, if we were staying in Yorkshire somewhere, and read aloud to us in the evening, and it was a really amazing thing that. I was lucky because I had both my parents were teachers. My father was an art teacher, my mother was a primary school teacher, and so we had lots of books and things around. But my sister was a natural reader. She would have read anything, anytime. As soon as she could read, she read. I was not a natural reader. I think I came to reading in a different way. And one of the things that probably really helped me value books and love books was because my mother took us to the library at least once a week, because that was her passion. And I think what it taught me was the ritual of going to a place that's all about books and being allowed to make the decision of what you're going to, what you're going to pick up, what you're going to choose. And interestingly, my only responsibility, the only responsibility I was ever given in my school career was one, giving out the little bottles of mini milk, which I was very proud of, and the other one was being the library monitor. And it meant we went onto the mobile library and picked books. And I loved that because I understood that you get to make this decision and you get to choose to follow an interest. And I was a big TV watcher. I watched an awful lot of television. But what I would say about TV, and I really agree with Kim, that it can go, you need to bring it back. But it can bring you back. I read all the Laura Ingalls Wilder books because I watched the very saccharine Little House on the Prairie. And when I read all the Laura Ingalls books, I realised they're not saccharine at all. They're really hardcore. Yeah. And they're about American pioneers and their history. Then I got really, really interested in American history. And I'd go to the library and I would order books because I hadn't realised that you could go and order books. And that's really exciting for a child. And you feel in charge of your own, your own creativity, your own passion. And I think that's terribly important for children to feel like they can follow a sort of chain of interest.
We do have help along the way. And I think what Michael said, somebody put into his hand the copy of Wordsworth. Somebody knew that that was the right thing to do for Michael. And for teachers, it is about allowing children choices, but sometimes they don't know what to choose from. And that's our role, is we know how to put the right book into the right hand at the right time.
Yes, and you undoubtedly need that. I mean, I also, at the same time as being, my teacher had made me a library monitor for a reason, because she could see that interest. But she always read to us at the end of the day, and she introduced me to a book called The Shrinking of Treehorn, which changed my life.
I'm going to come back to Nikki now, because Nikki and I have had conversations over time about this term reading for pleasure. And you're slightly sceptical about this whole idea of reading for pleasure, aren't you? Tell us about that.
I feel like the person that's raining on the parade right now. And I don't disagree with anything that's been said today. How could you? I mean, of course, it all makes good sense. What I do worry about a little bit is the term pleasure, which I think is a bit of a mask. It can stop you thinking beyond that. And actually, what we've heard from people today is more than just pleasure. It's more about it's more than about self-satisfaction. It's about knowing the world. It's about knowing and becoming wise through stories. And I think we do those things too. So let me just give you an example. I was in Tesco, as you are, the other day, and there were a couple of people talking in front of me very animatedly. They'd been reading for pleasure. They'd been reading the headlines of a newspaper and taking what they read as true. Definitely reading for pleasure, because they were excited and you could see the pleasure they were taking from it. And I know that as teachers, we definitely want to engage and pull readers in, but we also want readers who think and who are wise, and the stories are about developing better human beings. And actually, in all of the talks that we've heard that. So it's not disagreeing with what people are saying, but I think the word pleasure itself is a mask to something deeper, and it can stop people thinking more deeply.
So do we need to change the term?
Oh, gosh.
To something possibly
Ask
like...
Kim, she's the
reading
professor.
for fulfillment. Kim?
I don't have a thought about changing the term. I mean, we might say recreational reading or reading for improvement, but I think we should just say reading. But I did think of something else. In the Nordic countries, where a lot of people have summer houses and so on, they did a survey to map onto the one that we did here. And one of the things that they discovered, well, there were two things. One was that when people went away for their holidays, they often didn't have they didn't have electricity, basically, and they didn't take equipment with them. So the whole family would take a box of books, and they would all read the same books, mother, father, kids, and stuff. So you could all talk about the books, and all the books were valued, which I thought was really quite a terrific thing. And then the boys, who are often a group that we worry about, well, they had a very different investment in reading, and I don't think it wasn't pleasure. They saw power coming from reading, and they were really keen in getting new vocabulary, because they said, it helps me in all kinds of ways. It helps me at school, it helps me get a job, it helps me score with the girls. If I have a great vocabulary and a wide frame of reference. So they were seeing it as instrumental more than pleasurable in some ways, but they were reading for whatever reason.
Michael, any reflections on that?
No, I mean, I understand what you mean by the pleasure thing, though there's nothing wrong in pleasure.
Of course.
But I do think the pleasure should be used, for me, is the hook. The great thing is that they have to enjoy it first. And I think this is what many, many people on high have not understood. That you cannot teach literacy to unwilling children. You can try, and you'll fail mostly. You might get them to punctuate a little better, and they might get to spell a little better. But if you're talking about literacy in the big sense of the word, developing them as readers as well as that, then they have to be hooked by the enjoyment of reading. I think enjoy is a pretty wonderful word.